Hello students. All right, so today we are going to do higher level 10.3 and we're going to be looking at isolation barriers and we're going to be looking at examples of different isolation barriers that are prezygotic and postzygotic. So let's think about why is it that two organisms from a different species, why is it that they can't reproduce? Right? And why is it that these species remain as different species? Why is it that they cannot interbreed? So this is when we think of these types of reproductive isolation mechanisms that do not allow for different species to reproduce for different reasons. So there are two main categories of these reproductive isolation barriers. The first one is prezygotic isolation. And if we look at this picture here, in prezygotic isolation, this occurs before fertilization occurs. So in this type of isolation, no offspring is produced because the barrier happens here before the actual fertilization of the egg with the sperm. In postzygotic isolation, you do get a fertilized egg that might grow into an organism, but something happens to this offspring that they're either not viable or infertile. So let's look at the different examples of each. So we're going to start with prezygotic isolation, and actually let's go down to this table because it just shows everything all at once. So here we see the prezygotic isolation mechanisms. We see temporal, geographic or ecological, behavioral or mechanical. So in temporal, we see two species that mate at different times of the year. So because they mate at different times of the year, they will not be able to mate. In an example here are frogs that live in the same pond but breed during different seasons, the summer versus the spring. So the sperm from this frog will never be able to fertilize the egg from this frog. In ecological or geographical, this occurs when two species occupy different habitats. So we know that lions and tigers could potentially interbreed, but they don't because they live in different places. Behavioral isolation happens when two species have different courtship behaviors. So, for example, in mating songs or mating calls, certain groups of birds will only respond to a specific type of mating call. So again, this sperm will never fertilize this egg. And in mechanical prezygotic isolation, this occurs when the physical differences are just so distinct that the copulation mechanism or the pollination is just not possible. So here you see with certain breeds of dogs, they're so different morphologically speaking that they are incapable of mating. Okay, so one sperm from this dog will never fertilize the egg of this dog, unless it's done artificially, of course. Okay, so let's move down to postzygotic isolating mechanisms. And remember we said that in this particular type of isolation, we do have two different species that are able to produce an offspring, but then there's something wrong with that offspring, right? So it's postzygotic. So maybe there's a hybrid inviability. That means that the hybrid that is produced from the two different species fails to reach reproductive maturity. So here we see certain types of frogs from two different species might be able to reproduce, but the hybrid tadpoles die before they can become mature frogs because they're just not viable. So they don't reach reproductive maturity. In hybrid infertility, we see two separate species like the horse and the donkey. They can produce a mule, for example, but the mule is sterile. So the mule's not going to be able to reproduce any further. And in hybrid breakdown, we see, for example, you might have an offspring of hybrid copepods. They have less potential for survival or reproduction because even though the F1 hybrids are fertile, the F2 generation fails to develop properly, so they have a less chance of survival in the long run. Okay, so this is what's going to prevent two species that are different from reproducing viable offspring in postzygotic isolating mechanisms, or just not able to reproduce at all in prezygotic isolating mechanisms. Okay, that's it for that topic.